Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Callie McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by our very own Dungeons of Drakkenheim campaign, which is now live on Kickstarter.
Dungeons of Drakkenheim is a campaign for characters levels 1 to 13 set in a ruined dark fantasy city devastated by a cosmic cataclysm. One of the major components of our campaign is that as you adventure through the city of Drakkenheim, you will be caught up in the political intrigue between 5 rival factions struggling to rule the rubble.
During their adventures in Drakkenheim, your player characters can decide which of the 5 factions will be their allies and which of the 5 factions will be their enemies. And their choice will ultimately inform the final fate of the city and who they will face in the final showdown in Castle Draken.
You might join the Rangers of the Hooded Lanterns, a guerrilla military unit who's trying to reclaim the city of Drakkenheim and find a rightful heir to the throne of Westamar.
Or you might decide to throw in with the Queen's Men, a loose affiliation of 100 groups of outlaws, brigands, and bandits who have all come together under the rule of the mysterious Queen of Thieves.
You might join the righteous paladins of the Silver Order, oath-bound to battle supernatural evil and purge the city of contamination.
Or you might heed the call of Lucretia Matthias and the followers of the Falling Fire, those who herald the destruction of the city as the fulfillment of a celestial prophecy.
Or you may join the Amethyst Academy, a guild of sorcerers and wizards trying to learn and understand the horrors of Drakkenheim and the strange magics that lie within.
Which factions will rise and which factions will fall is up to you and your player characters to discover. You can check out our campaign, which is live on Kickstarter through to the end of July by following the links in the description below.
So with that, let's talk about faction intrigue. Factions are something that are a really compelling element in the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons. They give you prominent NPCs for your player characters to latch onto, to side with, and to figure out what paths they're going to take and who they are going to trust and who they are going to turn against in the long run of some of the great stories that we've seen in Dungeons & Dragons.
Fundamentally, a faction is an organization of people that are working together to achieve a common goal. A faction can be a variety of things. It can be a scholarly organization. It could be a military force. It could be a government. It could even be a religion or a thieves guild, a mage guild, or much, much more. Regardless of their specifics, factions are a really useful tool in Dungeons & Dragons because essentially a faction can tell the player characters a lot about what an individual non-player character believes in. A faction can have a very recognizable logo, or a uniform, or a particular color, or their own sayings or beliefs, and certainly they can interact with the player characters both, as you see in our own Drakkenheim campaign, as allies that the players can work with to achieve their objectives and to fight the evil and unite against the common enemy. Or factions can also be a rival or a foe. And this adaptability in how factions can work in your games is part of what makes them so exciting.
I also believe that factions in a Dungeons & Dragons campaign do a really good job of helping the Dungeon Master broadcast not only their story, but also world building to the player characters in a very meaningful way. Through the lens of various factions, you can get several different views on the way that the world works. And these separate views fill out a large window of opportunities for player characters to engage with. So rather than lore dumps and long essays about what your world is, having several different factions detail aspects of the world in meaningful ways means that the characters get to engage with that and get to make their own decisions on their views of the world.
Now, creating an interesting faction intrigue where several factions are involved in your campaign and maybe working against each other or making alliances between each other can actually feel like a very daunting task, especially because a lot of the common advice for running factions in D&D essentially regulates them to this kind of organization that your player characters can get points from, and the more points they get means that they unlock a magic item. And so basically the factions are kind of relegated to this role of like, here is an optional quest or a side quest, rather than something that is really front and center. And so often I think for Kelly and I, when we think of factions, we really think of the factions as the driving political forces in your campaign world. And pulling that off is difficult, but we've got some strategies to help you put that together today.
So one of the major components of any Dungeons & Dragons campaign is going to be what the major conflict is. Now, a great way to implement your factions is to have each of them have a differing opinion on the major conflict of your campaign. Rather than having one of them directly involved, the major conflict should be a separate entity from the factions, but they should affect each faction in a unique way, and each faction should have a different idea of how to deal with this major conflict.
This is a new way of thinking of the central conflict of your campaign. It needs to be what we might describe as a wicked problem. A problem that has no clear answer. And in many ways, we can derive a lot of inspiration from many of the biggest problems facing the real world today. There are so many issues that we can look at in real life where the answers are not necessarily obvious to how humanity should deal with those problems. And in fact, there are certain problems that people differ on very fundamental levels on the best way to solve these problems. We can look at these as inspiration, but also as ideas when we adapt them to a fantasy setting. Some of the really easy ones to look at are things like a global military conflict or a war, but you can also have conflicts such as a succession crisis. The previous ruler has died, leaving no clear heir to the throne, and there are various claimants that all have equally valid, potentially, claims to the same throne.
You could also have a limited resource, some sort of new element or some magical entity that has been brought into the world, and each of the factions has a different idea on what to do with this resource.
The biggest thing with doing an interesting faction intrigue, though, when you're designing your central conflict, is avoiding making it a force that all the factions can unite against. Because that's the difference between running a faction conflict or intrigue and running a save the world campaign. I like to think of a really great example of this as being the Second World War, where there was a clear and obvious threat for many disparate groups and nations to unite against and form basically two sides, right? But as soon as the Second World War was over, it was not very simple anymore. And there were a lot of disparate sorts of things that informed the conflicts afterwards. So the key to having a faction intrigue is really making sure that you avoid that clear and obvious villain that is the source of all the problems. Because in my experience with running faction intrigues, player characters will naturally try to do this thing that many video games and other stories presented with. Here are disparate factions. They're squabbling, and they have minor, small political issues. But you, as the player characters, can help them get over their differences and all work together to defeat a common foe. That is an awesome campaign. That is a great campaign. But that is not necessarily a faction intrigue campaign, where in many ways a faction intrigue campaign is about who's going to win and who's going to lose. No one's necessarily right in these conflicts. It's all about who's going to be left at the end.
Even if you are thinking of a big bad to be the primary conflict of your campaign, if you are hoping to run faction intrigue, it is important that there are extremely differing views on how to deal with this big problem. If you have an undead scourge spreading throughout the land, perhaps the faction of paladins want to destroy it at its core, while the faction of necromancers think that they can use their magic to help alleviate the problem and use it for good. These differing opinions could cause a major conflict, and these two factions may not get along. When looking at this sort of element, the question really needs to be, what sort of differing opinions are there, and how can you make each of the factions have a correct answer to solving the problem?
And of course, once again, the real world history can be really, really helpful here. Even if you do want to have a big foe that all these factions are uniting against, one of the things that we often don't think of in many fantasy stories is what happens after the big bad is defeated? And what does the world actually look like? And we see this in reality because the story of the world did not end when the Third Reich fell in World War II, and even before the war ended, the various factions of the Allies were already starting the political scheming of what the world was going to look like afterwards. And they had very different visions of what should happen in the aftermath of defeating their common foe. And so even when you do want to have that common foe narrative, where you can drive the wedge of a faction intrigue really and turn it up to 11 is really emphasizing, oh yeah, we're going to work with you, but afterwards we're going to be enemies. And as we work together, we're still trying to find ways to overcome one another.
The question then becomes, who is gaining what from the outcome of this campaign? And the rivalry between the factions could be who's going to come out on top and gain the most. And that's where the player characters choosing which factions to align themselves with is going to become an important part, even if they're fighting against a common enemy.
And I think the really cool thing to run this, especially where fantasy lets us detach from the real world, is that in the real world, all of us have deeply held opinions and beliefs. But in a fantasy setting, we can actually start to work to divorce those feelings because there's a level of abstraction that fantasy brings. And so I find as a dungeon master, when I am designing these conflicts and I'm designing these factions, I try to myself be as neutral as I possibly can and really try to make the analogs a bit of a metaphor. And sometimes my players are like, oh yeah, these guys are kind of like, the British, and these guys are kind of like the Russians. But even though players might have a real world opinion about those things, they might act differently in a role-playing game because it's not the British and the Russians, it's the elves and the dwarves now. And you bring your own preconceived notions of elves and dwarves to that whole sort of idea. So there's a careful balance to be struck here, but this is one of those places where fantasy can be really, really powerful because it can actually allow us to think about the what-ifs with a level of extraction that allows people that even have different opinions about things to still have fun playing a fantasy game together.
This lends into our next point, which we really want to drive this home, that there is no correct answer. And as a dungeon master, you really need to make sure that you don't have a correct answer in your mind. In that before mentioned paladins and necromancers, if you're like, well, the paladins clearly know what they're talking about and the necromancers are actually evil, then you've already made that decision for your players. But when you're designing your factions, it's really important to you as a dungeon master get behind each of your faction's ideas. Figure out why they are right. And if you believe that each faction has the potential to be right, it means that no matter who your players decide to side with, you can get behind that and drive that narrative forward. Don't make the decisions on the outside of the campaign. Leave it open-ended and let your players decide.
When I design my factions, I actually think of them like one big NPC, and I actually give the faction as a whole personality traits, bonds, ideals, and flaws. And I try to create a balance in those role-playing traits where the factions have many admirable traits, many things that my players will readily agree with and support, and where the players will go, yeah, these guys are absolutely right about this. But then I make sure that every faction has a bad side to them as well. Every faction has something about them that is just a little shady or a little questionable or a little bit immoral or things that they ignore. Not only does this make the factions feel much more real, because when we look at real-world organizations, there's usually a lot of good things and a lot of bad things about them. But you kind of have that balance of like, yeah, these paladins are really, really, really noble, but they're also really hardlined about their religion, and they aren't really interested in working with people who don't share their beliefs. Or these necromancers are really, really brilliant and really, really interesting, and they have their own ethical principles, but they also like digging up corpses, and that's kind of awful. So you have to make sure that you balance these things out so that even when you do have two factions, like a faction of necromancers and a faction of paladins, you don't have the players go immediately, we're working with these guys.
Yeah. I think the other great thing about creating all of your factions with equal opportunities to be the good or the bad guys means that you can pose interesting questions to your player characters. If they start leaning one way, you can present a compelling argument from the other factions that might make them start to question which is the right answer. Again, with no correct answer, this makes it much more compelling, and the the choices laid out before your player characters become much more interesting if you as a DM can deliver those narratives and start to kind of twist the ideas. Well, the necromancers are evil because they dig up corpses, but then they listen to the necromancers for a few minutes and realize that they actually have some really great ideas and are solving a lot of problems. So now that becomes a much more interesting question.
One really great way that you can throw a whole wrench into this whole thing is thinking about the key NPCs that exemplify the faction. For me personally, when I design a faction, I think of two central characters for every faction. The faction leader, who is the overall commander of that entire faction, and the faction's lieutenant, who is kind of the second in command. And in many cases, I like to make the faction lieutenant a really likable person who befriends the player characters early on the campaign by sending them on a rather innocuous quest. And so when I run my faction Intrigue, what I usually try to do is have the player characters meet the lieutenant as a representative of all the factions that are going to be involved. So the players can meet all the factions in a low stakes way first. And they get to know one person who is the face of that faction, the lieutenant. And so the player characters will be like, yeah, your faction has some weird beliefs, but I like you. And that really complicates matters for players when they have an NPC that they like, but that NPC has some strange loyalties to them. And so once that NPC then says, hey, here's my faction leader, I really believe in this person. Now you've got this mouthpiece that the players trust who's introducing them to the faction leader, who is often the most extreme personality within the faction. I love the faction leader kind of being the ideals of that faction writ large. And then oftentimes my faction leaders almost always have a dark secret though too.
So as we start thinking about the ideals and personalities of our multiple factions and all of their beliefs centered around our core conflict, the next question becomes, how many factions do we have? There is a very strong possibility here that if you have too few factions, it becomes a much more small choice for the player characters and doesn't impact the campaign in a large way. But if you have too many factions, it can bloat your campaign and make it much more complicated than it needs to be. We actually have some pretty cool ideas on how to find the exact right number of factions for your campaign.
So if you have a faction Intrigue campaign, oftentimes your players will meet these factions, they'll decide who they like, and they will inevitably try to make alliances, relationships, and connections between them. One thing you want to avoid is having an even number of factions, because if you do, this allows your faction Intrigue to collapse into factions 1 and 2 versus factions 3 and 4. You end up now with not 4 factions, but really just 2 factions. You end up with kind of the Axis and the Allies, the even break between them. So I like to have an odd number of factions, but of course within this, there's always going to be kind of a wild card. So if we're going to go with an odd number of factions, 3 feels like too few.
3 feels like you're still going to get 1 versus 1, and then there's this awkward outlier, and then it's always going to end up 2 versus 1, which just seems unfair to that one faction that you've chosen as your enemy. 3 does feel a little too small scale for a wide-spanning campaign.
Now, we could go with 7 factions, which would be a lot of work. Because, as we talked about, you want to have every faction have some role-playing traits, a leader, a couple key NPCs, and their clear objective. And as soon as we get beyond 7 factions, that's when I find it actually gets hard for the players to remember who the factions are. There's this kind of this theory in writing stories where you really want to kind of keep things to around 6 or 7. Is that like that's how many things people can remember in their head? So I try to keep it simple in that respect. So I think for myself, I think the magic number is 5.
I agree. I do think that 5 factions, one of our favorite places to look for this inspiration is actually Magic the Gathering and the various colors that they represent. And you have 5 different options there. And actually, that's a great template for building factions.
And now, in the Ravnica setting, which has 10 factions, where they cheat on that is that the factions in Ravnica are combos of 2 colors. So you get this really easy understanding of how to multiply that up to 10. So I think that really it works well to go with the number of 5, because then you can, you always have these 2 factions are working together, these 2 factions are working together, but then there's always an interloper that can shift the balance, but not dramatically so. I think also, you see this even in the Forgotten Realms, where if you've played Adventurers League, they have 5 factions there as well. You can always expand things and have sub-factions and smaller things, but if you are setting out to do your faction intrigue for the very first time, I think designing 5 really good, fleshed-out factions is really achievable for most Dungeon Masters and won't make it too overwhelming for you either when you're running it.
Now, if you are well-versed in faction intrigue and you're just looking at this video for tips and tricks, I do think that there is an avenue to take 7 in a large-scale, world-spanning campaign. But we have found that 5 is a great number, so I would say as a final statement that 5 to 7 is probably your sweet spot for faction intrigue. I do think that if we're looking at odd numbers, if you're going up to 9, then you kind of end up with a similar situation to the 2 or the 3, where you actually end up with 3, 3, and 3.
Yeah, that's true. You end up with this kind of 3-way conflict. I think the other reason why I like 5 is that it's really easy to do. You want the players to meet all the factions and kind of understand who they are. And the best way to do that is, as we said, have the lieutenant of the faction offer them a rather innocuous quest that doesn't really deal with the main conflict, or if it does, it's in a minor way. And doing 5 little quests is something that you can really easily cover either in 5 game sessions. It's like, here's a one-shot for each faction. And that's really easy to plan. And I just find that by the time you get to 7 or 9, the players have forgotten what they did with those first 2 factions. Too much time has passed. They kind of become names on a page rather than people that believe in things.
So as we go to flesh out our factions and give them the ideals and personalities that they're going to carry through the entire campaign, what sort of elements are we going to look for to bring them to life?
So as we said at the beginning, all the factions have their objective, their goal within the conflict that you've created for your campaign. But I like to make sure that the faction's goal and their ideals or their ideology are actually separate things. I use the role-playing traits that are used for NPCs, ideals, bonds, flaws, and personality traits, and you can literally almost design a background for each faction and use that as a template for your faction NPCs. I think it's a really great model to use as you're fleshing out, who is this faction, what they believe in. Of course, not every member of the faction is going to be a perfect match for all those traits, but then that gives you a way of kind of saying, okay, here's my background for this faction, but then this individual character within them is a soldier or an artisan or a sailor. So it gives you that fun matrix to play with.
It also means that if you have this sort of NPC block that spans through your entire faction, it means that if you're ever struggling to come up with roleplay on the spot, you can use this as the template to inspire improv roleplay. If suddenly guard number 17 becomes a prominent NPC because your players have started questioning them and have dragged them out on a mission with them or something of that sort, you can immediately apply a personality to this character because of the faction they belong to. So this becomes a really helpful tool for inspiring all of the NPCs within a faction. You can add little differences here and there, but you always have a foundation to fall back to.
Once you've got that foundation, the real thing then is deciding, what does your faction actually need from the player characters? Oftentimes factions need things like plausible deniability or they need the specific skills of the player characters. Your faction might be very specialized in that they're all monks or they're all rangers. So they need the player characters because they need their spellcasting support or their help in some way. Or maybe the player characters are just influential and they might swing the balance of power. And at that point, you're back to designing adventures and plot hooks. And you can look at the objective of the faction, their ideals, and what they might need from the player characters and start sending them on quests. Where the intrigue comes into play is that the factions have different opinions on the outcomes of those various quests that they're going to send the players on. And as you kind of build things out, oftentimes, eventually the factions might say, hey, player characters, we're the necromancers, but you know what? This paladin just died, and it would be really awesome if you could steal his body so we can resurrect him as a Death Knight. And then now you have a quest where the two factions' ideals are directly in conflict. And so I like to usually have a couple quests that don't ask the players to work against the factions and then kind of hit them with look, we really need you to do this thing that's going to put you in a lot of hot water.
And as you're looking at building these quests that are going to conflict between the factions, something to keep in mind is that oftentimes factions and their leaders and their lieutenants and their NPCs may not always act in logical ways. This is a very important point to broadcast because if we look at the real world as an example, a lot of groups of people who have great ideals and are hoping to overcome great obstacles don't always achieve those and don't always act in logical ways. They make terrible mistakes, they make bad decisions, and they give in to their flaws. And sometimes a flawed leader to a faction, that flaw could ripple through the entire faction. This doesn't mean that you should let your factions crumble from the inside out, but if you take into account the flaws that you've given them and how those might impact decision making, don't necessarily try to think that the necromancers know exactly what the right answer is to every solution, and same with the paladins. They might make some horrible mistakes and make some bad calls along the way.
As an example, perhaps your player characters explore a dungeon where they uncover a copy of the Necronomicon. Both the necromancers and the paladins and maybe the Thieves Guild get word of this, and the paladins say, hey, you guys should burn that book. And the necromancers, they want it. They want the knowledge in there. And the thieves are like, you know what? We could probably profit from this somehow. And your players might look at this situation and go, this book is evil. The paladins are absolutely right. But it doesn't matter that they feel that way. The necromancers still value that item, even though it is evil. And yes, it's not logical. The necromancers believe that they could use it, harness it. They might be totally wrong. Doesn't matter. You're not going to rashly convince them to give that up because that's what they want.
When you're designing your factions, you also want to keep in mind the resources that they have at their disposal. A mages guild might have a lot of magic items and spell components that they can offer the party, whereas a more military organization might have really awesome weapons and armor and just helpful tools that they can lend to the party as they venture forward. Keeping track of the different resources that your factions have and what they can offer the party also means that your party deciding which faction to ally with might reward them in different ways.
Yeah, and sometimes this can be uneven and help highlight the differences between the factions. Maybe the necromancers are willing to translate the Necronomicon and teach the players the spells inside it. The paladins just want the player characters to burn that book, and they're not really offering any reward for doing it because they believe that a good deed is its own reward. And so now there's an imbalance. Are the player characters going to destroy this clearly evil book? Are they going to learn the magic from it? It creates that imbalance. And I think that's an important thing, is that your factions don't need to have balanced resources, and they definitely shouldn't have infinite resources. I like to make a roster of this, and maybe the paladins, hey, there's 300 paladins, and if the player characters want to go and kill every single one of them, that's one way to wipe out a faction. Maybe the necromancers are a very small faction, and they're just a small group of maybe 12 necromancers. So the loss of a single member in that faction is a really big problem for them, and that explains why they can't just all of a sudden summon up a giant undead army, because, hey, 12 necromancers, they got to manage their spell slots too.
And I do think that this also means that by limiting the resources of your factions, it brings into the spotlight why they need the player characters. Maybe they're stretched thin, and the goals that they're trying to achieve are just beyond their grasp. But having the player characters jump in and be able to lend themselves to what that faction needs to accomplish means that they now have the assets and tools they need to accomplish their goals. So pushing your factions right to the limit, and at the outset of the campaign saying, yeah, there's only 12 necromancers, and the Necronomicon is in that mountain guarded by a dragon, and we can't necessarily go get it, but maybe you can. This means that the faction needs the player characters, and now they are essential for the plotline of your campaign.
This is especially so with high-level NPCs and powerful magic. Yeah, the Necromancers are a faction of 12 spellcasters, but are all 12 of them 20th level spellcasters? Probably not. Maybe only the leader of the Necromancers is a powerful lich, secretly, of course. But that doesn't mean that they can just give the player characters any number of magic items or cast spells for them, because again, they got limited access to that magic. Similarly, the paladins might have a lot of healing, and the guild of thieves might have a lot of money. But the Guild of Thieves, you know, they can get a bunch of toughs off the street, they can buy a bunch of assassins, but they have to manage that money really carefully, because if the reputation on the street of the thieves goes bad, they're not going to be able to hire those assassins anymore if a job goes wrong. So every faction kind of has to have some weaknesses to it and some limitations, because if all the factions are all powerful and can just get everything they need, it kind of starts to beg the question of, like, why do they need the player characters in there? Because that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges with a faction Intrigue is not making the factions so powerful that the players don't have any room for influence.
So because you're designing your factions in a way where they might need the player characters, this also brings us to our next point, which is that the factions are going to demand loyalty of the player characters. This is where the real conflict comes in. As you start to progress through the campaign, through the story, and there's these differing objectives and these differing viewpoints, well, each faction wants the player characters to align with them and their beliefs in order to push the narrative forward, which means at some point, a line in the sand needs to be drawn, and the player characters need to choose who is their allies and who is their enemies.
There might not be a huge ideological difference between the Paladins and the Thieves Guild. Maybe the Thieves Guild have a lot of honor among thieves. But the fact that the player characters are even associating with the thieves is a problem for both the Paladins and the Thieves. Because the Thieves Guild is like, yeah, we like you guys, you're super cool, but you're also associating with those Paladins, and we're worried that one day you're just going to help them arrest us. The inverse can also be true, in that the Paladins might think, completely irrationally even, that the player characters are maybe an inside job, are trying to take them down from the inside, and that their true loyalty lies with the thieves. So many factions might require the player characters to demonstrate their loyalty and prove that the player characters aren't actually double agents. And I think that this is the really big thing that differentiates a Unite the Factions campaign from a faction Intrigue campaign, in that in a faction Intrigue campaign, all the factions share one fundamental trait. They're all kind of paranoid, and they don't trust each other. And all of them kind of have in the back of their minds, these player characters are really useful, but what if they're going to betray us?
And this is where you want to go back to those quests that we mentioned before, where it's going to force the player characters to choose their loyalties. Once they get their hands on the Necronomicon, what are they going to do with it? These are the important moments that will define the faction Intrigue campaign and decide which faction the player characters truly believe the goals of.
Now, this can all sound very ambitious, but the truth of the matter is that preparing a faction Intrigue like this is really just an extension of the skills that we already have as Dungeon Masters. If you can design a compelling NPC, you can design a faction. Because really, a faction is just one big NPC that just has a lot of bodies and people involved in it. You can design your factions in that same way, with ideals, goals, personality traits, and flaws, and they just happen to have a lot of resources. I like to have my faction leaders often be like 20th level player characters that have their own strongholds and followers. And in many respects, I roleplay them that way as well. And so rather than needing to make this really complex decision tree and plotting out the way every faction is going to react to every possible thing that might happen, roleplaying it like an NPC, which is what they are, is going to give you a framework to work with that is much easier to prepare and allows the player characters to do unexpected things. And that's the real magic of a faction Intrigue, is that the players really have so much influence on how it works out.
And don't forget that while you're designing them, make sure that your player characters end up in the thick of it. Try to make a compelling argument for all of the factions and put your player characters in the spotlight, where their choices and the decisions that they make are going to define the campaign and really tell the story of the choices that they made along the way and who ends up winning the victory in the end.
And if you're still hearing all this and you think it sounds really ambitious, well, we've designed all this for our Drakkenheim campaign. It's now live on Kickstarter, and we've fully fleshed out the 5 factions of Drakkenheim using these theories and principles and put them really on the page in that way, detailing their objectives, their personality traits, their resources, and other key NPCs. It's a lot of fun to design a faction in this way, and we might talk about more of the specifics of how we built these traits in a future video. If you'd be interested in seeing that, let us know in the comments below.
So this has been a look at how to run faction Intrigue. Let us know some of the great factions that you've created and how they've worked in play at your table as well.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider checking us out on Patreon by following the links in the description below.
And don't forget to check out our live play Shadows of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more great videos with advice for Dungeon Masters right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.